The 9-Mile Walk, written by Harry Kemelman and narrated by Tony Walker. I had made an ass of myself in a speech I'd given at the Good Government Association dinner, and Nicky Welt had cornered me at breakfast at the Blue Moon, where we both ate occasionally, for the pleasure of rubbing it in. I had made the mistake of departing from my prepared speech to criticise a statement my predecessor in the office of county attorney had made to the press. I had drawn a number of inferences from his statement, and had thus left myself open to a rebuttal which he had promptly made, and which had the effect of making me appear intellectually dishonest. I was new to this political game, having but a few months before left the law school faculty to become the Reform Party candidate for county attorney. I said as much in extenuation, but Nicholas Welt, who could never drop his pedagogical manner — he was Snowden Professor of English Language and Literature — replied in much the same tone that he would dismiss a request from a sophomore for an extension on a term paper. That's no excuse. Although he's only 2 or 3 years older than I, in his late 40s, he always treats me like a schoolmaster hectoring a stupid pupil, and I, perhaps because he looks so much older, with his white hair and lined gnome-like face, suffer it. They were perfectly logical inferences, I pleaded. My dear boy, he purred, although human intercourse is well nigh impossible without inference, most inferences are usually wrong. The percentage of error is particularly high in the legal profession, where the intention is not to discover what the speaker wishes to convey, but rather what he wishes to conceal. I picked up my cheque and eased out from behind the table. I suppose you're referring to cross-examination of witnesses in court. Well, there's always an opposing counsel who'll object if the inference is illogical. Who said anything about logic? He retorted. An inference can be logical and still not be true. He followed me down the aisle to the cashier's booth. I paid my cheque and waited impatiently while he searched in an old-fashioned change purse, fishing out coins one by one and placing them on a counter beside his cheque, only to discover that the total was insufficient. He slid them back into his purse and with a tiny sigh extracted a bill from another compartment of the purse and handed it to the cashier. Give me a sentence of 10 or 12 words, he said, and I'll build you a logical chain of inferences that you never dreamed of when you framed the sentence. Other customers were coming in, and since the space in front of the cashier's booth was small, I decided to wait outside until Nicky completed his transaction with the cashier. I remember being mildly amused at the idea that he probably thought I was still at his elbow and was going right ahead with his discourse. When he joined me on the sidewalk, I said, "A 9-mile walk is no joke, especially in the rain." "No, I shouldn't think it would be," he agreed absently. Then he stopped in his stride and looked at me sharply. "What the devil are you talking about?" "It's a sentence, and it has 11 words, I insisted, and I repeated the sentence, ticking off the words on my fingers. "What about it?" "You said that given a sentence of 10 or 12 words—" "Oh, yes." He looked at me suspiciously. "Where did you get it?" "It just popped into my head." "Come on now, build your inferences." "You're serious about this?" he asked, his little blue eyes glittering with amusement. "You really want me to?" It was just like him to issue a challenge and then to appear amused when I accepted it, and it made me angry. "Put up or shut up," I said. "All right," he said mildly. "No need to be huffy. I'll play." Let me see. How did the sentence go? "A 9-mile walk is no joke, especially in the rain." Not much to go on there. "It's more than 10 words," I rejoined. "Very well." His voice became crisp as he mentally squared off to the problem. "First inference, the speaker is aggrieved." I'll grant that, I said, although it hardly seems to be an inference. It's really implicit in the sentence. He nodded impatiently. Next inference. The rain was unforeseen, otherwise he would have said, a 9-mile walk in the rain is no joke, instead of using the especially phrase as an afterthought. I'll allow that, I said, although it's pretty obvious. First inferences should be obvious, said Nicky tartly. I let it go at that. He seemed to be floundering, and I didn't want to rub it in. Next inference. The speaker is not an athlete or an outdoors man. You'll have to explain that one, I said. It's the especially phrase again, he said. The speaker doesn't say that a 9-mile walk in the rain is no joke, but merely the walk, just the distance, mind you, is no joke. Now, 9 miles is not such a terribly long distance. You walk more than half that in 18 holes of golf, and golf is an old man's game, he added slyly. I play golf. Well, that would be all right under ordinary circumstances, I said, but there are other possibilities. The speaker might be a soldier in the jungle, in which case 9 miles would be a pretty good hike, rain or no hike. Yes, and Nicky was sarcastic, and the speaker might be one-legged. For that matter, the speaker might be a graduate student writing a PhD thesis on humour and starting by listing all the things that are not funny. See here, I'll have to make a couple of assumptions before I continue. How do you mean? I asked suspiciously. Remember, I'm taking this sentence in vacuo, as it were. I don't know who said it or what the occasion was. Normally a sentence belongs in the framework of a situation. I see. What assumptions do you want to make? For one thing, I want to assume that the intention was not frivolous, that the speaker is referring to a walk that was actually taken, and that the purpose of the walk was not to win a bet or something of that sort. That seems reasonable enough, I said. And I also want to assume that the locale of the walk is here. You mean in Fairfield? Not necessarily, I mean in this general section of the country. Fair enough. Then, if you grant these assumptions, you'll have to accept my last inference that the speaker is no athlete or outdoors man. Well, all right, go on. Then, my next inference is that the walk was taken very late at night or very early in the morning, say between midnight and 5 or 6 in the morning. How do you figure that one? I asked. Consider the distance, 9 miles. We're in a fairly well-populated section. Take any road and you'll find a community of some sort in less than 9 miles. Hadley's 5 miles away, Hadley Falls is 7.5, Gorton is 11, but East Gorton is only 8, and you strike East Gorton before you come to Gorton. There's a local train service along the Gorton Road and bus service along the others. All the highways are pretty well travelled. Would anyone have to walk 9 miles in a rain unless it were late at night, when no buses or trains were running, and when the few automobiles that were out would hesitate to pick up a stranger on the highway? He might not have wanted to have been seen, I suggested. Nicky smiled pityingly. You think he would be less noticeable trudging along the highway than he would be riding in a public conveyance where everyone is usually absorbed in his newspaper? Well, I won't press the point, I said brusquely. Then try this one. He was walking toward a town rather than away from one. I nodded. It's more likely, I suppose. If he were in a town, he could probably arrange for some sort of transportation. Is that the basis for your inference? Partly that, said Nicky, but there is also an inference to be drawn from the distance. Remember, it's a 9-mile walk, and 9 is one of the exact numbers. I'm afraid I don't understand. That exasperated schoolteacher look appeared on Nicky's face again. Suppose you say, I took a 10-mile walk or a 100-mile drive. I would assume that you actually walked anywhere from 8 to a dozen miles, or that you rode between 90 and 110 miles. In other words, 10 and 100 are round numbers. you might have walked exactly 10 miles, or just as likely, you might have walked approximately 10 miles. But when you speak of walking 9 miles, I have the right to assume that you have named an exact figure. Now, we are far more likely to know the distance of the city from a given point than we are to know the distance of a given point from the city. That is, ask anyone in the city how far out Farmer Brown lives, and if he knows him, he will say 3 or 4 miles. But ask Farmer Brown how far he lives from the city, and he will tell you 3 6/10 miles. Measured it on my speedometer many a time. It's weak, Nicky, I said. But in conjunction with your own suggestion that he could have arranged transportation if he had been in a city. Yes, that would do it, I said. I'll pass it. Any more? I've just begun to hit my stride, he boasted. My next inference is that he was going to a definite destination and that he had to be there at a particular time. It was not a case of going off to help because his car broke down, or his wife was going to have a baby, or somebody was trying to break into his house. Oh, come now, I said. The car breaking down is really the most likely situation. He could have known the exact distance from having checked the mileage just as he was leaving the town. Nicky shook his head. Rather than walk 9 miles in the rain, he would have curled up on the back seat and gone to sleep, or at least stayed by his car and tried to flag another motorist. Remember, it's 9 miles. What would be the least it would take him to hike it? 4 hours, I offered. He nodded. Certainly no less, considering the rain. We've agreed that it happened very late at night or very early in the morning. Suppose he had his breakdown at 1 o'clock in the morning. You'll be 5 o'clock before he would arrive. That's daybreak. You begin to see a lot of cars on the road. The buses start just a little later. In fact, the first buses hit Fairfield around 5:30. Besides, if he were going for help, he wouldn't have to go all the way to town, only as far as the nearest telephone. No, he had a definite appointment. And it was in a town, and it was for some time before 5:30. Then why couldn't he have got there earlier and waited, I asked. He could have taken the last bus, arrived around 1 o'clock, and waited until his appointment. He walked 9 miles in the rain instead, and you said he was no athlete. We had arrived at the municipal building where my office is. Normally, any arguments begun at the Blue Moon ended at the entrance to the municipal building, but I was interested in Nicky's demonstration, and I suggested that he come up for a few minutes. When we were seated, I said, "How about it, Nicky? Why couldn't he have arrived early and waited?" "He could have," Nicky retorted, "but since he did not, we must assume that he was either detained until after the last bus left, or that he had to wait where he was for a signal of some sort, perhaps a telephone call. Then, according to you, he had an appointment sometime between midnight and 5:30. We can draw it much finer than that. Remember, it takes him 4 hours to walk the distance. The last bus stops at 12:30 a.m. If he doesn't take that, but starts at the same time, he won't arrive at his destination until 4:30. On the other hand, if he takes the first bus in the morning, he'll arrive around 5:30. That would mean that his appointment was for some time between 4:30 and 5:30. You mean that if his appointment was earlier than 4:30, he would have taken the last night bus, and if it was later than 5:30, he would have taken the first morning bus? Precisely. And another thing, if he was waiting for a signal or a phone call, it must have come not much later than 1 o'clock. Yes, I see that, I said. If his appointment is around 5 o'clock and it takes him 4 hours to walk the distance, he'd have to start around 1. He nodded, silent and thoughtful. For some queer reason I couldn't explain, I didn't feel like interrupting his thoughts. On the wall was a large map of the county, and I walked over to it and began to study it. "You're right, Nicky," I remarked over my shoulder. There's no place as far as 9 miles away from Fairfield that doesn't hit another town first. Fairfield's right in the middle of a bunch of smaller towns. He joined me at the map. Doesn't have to be Fairfield, you know, he said quietly. It was probably one of the outlying towns he had to reach. Try Hadley. Why Hadley? What would anyone want in Hadley at 5 o'clock in the morning? The Washington Flyer stops there to take on water about that time, he said quietly. That's right too, I said. I've heard that train many a night when I couldn't sleep. I'd hear it pulling in, and then a minute or two later I'd hear the clock on the Methodist church banging out 5. I went back to my desk for a timetable. The Flyer leaves Washington at 12:47 a.m. and gets into Boston at 8 a.m. Nicky was still at the map, measuring distances with a pencil. Exactly 9 miles from Hadley is the Old Sumter Inn, he announced. Old Sumter Inn, I echoed, but that upsets the whole theory. You can arrange for transportation there as easily as you can in a town. He shook his head. The cars are kept in an enclosure, and you have to get an attendant to check you through the gate. The attendant would remember anyone taking his car at a strange hour. It's a pretty conservative place. He could have waited in his room until he got a call from Washington about someone on the Flyer, maybe the number of the car and the berth. Then he could just slip out of the hotel and walk to Hadley. I stared at him, hypnotized. It wouldn't be difficult to slip aboard while the train was taking on water. And then, if he knew the car number and the berth... Nicky, I said portentously, as the Reform District Attorney who campaigned on an economy program, I am going to waste the taxpayers' money and call Boston long distance. It's ridiculous, it's insane, but I'm going to do it. His little blue eyes glittered, and he moistened his lips with the tip of his tongue. Go ahead, he said, hoarsely. I replaced the telephone in its cradle. Nicky, I said, this is probably the most remarkable coincidence in the history of criminal investigation. A man was found murdered in his berth on last night's 12:47 from Washington. He'd been dead about 3 hours, which would make it exactly right for Hadley. I thought it was something like that, said Nicky, but you're wrong about its being a coincidence. It can't be. Where did you get that sentence? It was just a sentence. It simply popped into my head. It couldn't have. It's not the sort of sentence that pops into one's head. If you had taught composition as long as I have, you'd know that when you ask someone for a sentence of 10 words or so, you get an ordinary statement such as, I like milk, with the other words made up by a modifying clause like, because it's good for my health. The sentence you offered related to a particular situation. But I tell you, I talked to no one this morning, and I was alone with you at the Blue Moon. You weren't with me all the time I paid my check, he said sharply. Did you meet anyone while you were waiting on the sidewalk for me to come out of the Blue Moon? I shook my head. I was outside less than a minute before you joined me. You see, a couple of men came in while you were digging out your change, and one of them bumped me, so I thought I'd wait. Did you ever see them before? Who? The 2 men who came in, he said, the note of exasperation creeping into his voice again. Why, no, they weren't anyone I knew. Were they talking? I guess so. Yeah, they were. Quite absorbed in their conversation, as a matter of fact. Otherwise, they would have noticed me, and I would not have been bumped. Not many strangers come into the Blue Moon, he remarked. Do you think it was they? I asked eagerly. I think I'd know them again if I saw them. Nicky's eyes narrowed. It's possible. There had to be 2. One to trail the victim in Washington and ascertain his berth number. The other to wait here and do the job. The Washington man would be likely to come down here afterwards. If there was theft as well as murder, it would be to divide the spoils. If it was just murder, he would probably have come down to pay off his confederate. I reached for the telephone. We'd been gone less than half an hour, Nicky went. They were just coming in, and service is slow at the Blue Moon. The one who walked all the way from Hadley must certainly be hungry, and the other probably drove all night from Washington. Call me immediately if you want to make an arrest, I said into the phone, and hung up. Neither of us spoke a word while we waited. We paced the door, avoiding each other almost as though we had done something we were ashamed of. The telephone rang at last. I picked it up and listened. Then I said, "Okay," and turned to Nicky. "One of them tried to escape through the kitchen, but Wynne had someone stationed at the back and they got him." "That would seem to prove it," said Nicky with a frosty little smile. I nodded agreement. He glanced at his watch. "Gracious," he exclaimed. "I wanted to make an early start on my work this morning, and here I've already wasted all this time talking to you." I let him get to the door. "Oh, Nicky," I called. "What was it you set out to prove?" "That a chain of inferences could be logical and still not be true," he said. "Oh, what are you laughing at?" he asked snappishly. And then he laughed too. So this is the part of the podcast where I talk about the story a little bit. If you don't want the commentary, I am starting to put together some compilations of just short stories chained together. There will be more of those, but you'll find those on the YouTube channel. It's not possible for me to do those on the podcast that goes out on Spotify, Apple, etc. Okay, so The 9 Mile Walk by Harry Kemelman is a short but really well received story, and I'm sure you will agree that it deserves that. So let's say something about him. Harry Kemelman, born in 1908, in 1996 and died in 1996, was an American mystery writer and English professor. Could have guessed that, eh? Renowned for creating the fictional sleuth Rabbi David Small. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts. Kemelman earned a bachelor's degree from Boston University and a master's degree from Harvard University. He taught various schools before and after World War II, during which he served as a wage administrator for the United States Army Transportation Corps. Kemelman's writing career took off with short stories for Ellery Queen's mystery magazine, including the acclaimed The 9 Mile Walk, which you've just heard. His Rabbi Small series began with the best-selling Friday the Rabbi Slept Late, which won the 1965 Edgar Award for the best first novel. Kemelman's works are celebrated for their blend of mystery and insights into conservative Judaism, leaving a lasting impact on the genre. He passed away in Marblehead, Massachusetts. I've never been. Sounds a great place. At the age of 88. I'd just love to go to somewhere called Marblehead. The 9 Mile Walk itself, a short story, obviously, by Harry Kemelman, first published in Ellery Queen's in 1947, considered a classic of the mystery genre. It features Nicholas, or Nicky Welt, a New England college professor, very much like your man himself, Kemelman, who solves crimes through logical deduction. Or does he? Well, he maybe does, but I'm not sure that this is, and I've got something to say about that. In 2003, Spanish director Alvaro Brechner, or Brechner, it's not a Spanish name, adapted The 9 Mile Walk into a short film, which was shot in Toledo in Spain. The film garnered critical acclaim, being shown at over 100 international film festivals. That's the film. The development of the Nicky Welt stories, and this is taken from the introduction to the collection, which I just briefly read, began as a pedagogical, as some people say, experiment into Harry Kemelman's advanced composition class. So he was teaching this, where he aimed to demonstrate to his students that words do not exist in isolation, but have meanings that transcend their usual connotations. This is all to do with postmodernism, really. And if we look at Jacques Derrida, who was a French philosopher, and he developed a method of semiotic analysis known as deconstruction. And central to this is the idea of the text. And we haven't got enough space to talk about all of it, but he talks about the text, which is to say that the text does not, and this is this text, but he includes all sorts of systems of symbolic interaction, not just language. But he says that the text is not can never be understood in isolation. Kemelman's teaching that language doesn't exist in isolation is very much, it does appear to be very much in this school of thought. So in the class, apparently the story is there was a newspaper headline and Kemelman created a sentence for his class to infer from, which led to the creation of the first Nicky Welch story, The 9 Mile Walk. So, his point is that they're lawyers in the story. Oh, well, one of them's a lawyer and the other's a professor of English, as we've already said. Nicky Welch is a professor of English. And he says, you can draw conclusions that appear to be perfectly logical, but are also untrue. Whereas the other guy's saying that I think the inference is, is that the inferences are, because they're plausible, they must be true. This says an awful lot of really interesting things, I think. So apparently it took 14 years of intermittent attempts for Kemelman to complete the 9 Mile Walk. I should just say that I think it's a fantastic story. I'd probably say the flaw I see in it towards the end. And again, I always say, this is just me. This is what I think. I'm nobody special. So don't think I'm setting myself up, because I'm not. Nicky Welch is what they call an armchair detective, eh? So these are these chaps who solve their cases through pure deduction. I suppose Sherlock Holmes isn't quite, he does get his hands dirty, but Poirot, for example, often solves cases using his little grey cells, and there's this idea that the case could be solved purely through reason rather than empirical observation. Of course, again, this strikes at the heart of our culture. How do we know things? Well, there are two schools of thought, of course. One is on one side of the philosophers who use reason and who may claim that reason alone, just actually thinking and logical chains of deduction are enough to discover the world. And then you have the scientists who say, forget that, we want to test things. So this is the empirical view that truth is found by going out and testing things. And the fact that we are still arguing about the same philosophical questions that everybody in recorded human history has argued about perhaps suggests that the philosophers aren't quite as good at determining truth, but they are very good at arguing amongst each other. Whereas the scientists, to be fair to them, have made much more progress since science started in the Enlightenment, really. Or, yeah, indeed. So there we go. So, but the armchair detectives are very much on the side of the philosophers, whereby, we can reason things out. We can discover the truth about the world through reason alone. There we are. So the story talks about the power of language. So if you remember, the claim that it's all based on is, give me a sentence and I will draw a series of, he says, I can't remember his exact word, but the inference, I keep saying that word, is that they are plausible. Yeah, plausible inferences. I think he says logical, or that's the idea. There's a big difference between logical and plausible. And I think what he's doing is not so much logic in the philosophical sense. So I'm sticking up for philosophers now, in a sense. I hope you're still with me. But he says that it's logical, but it's not logical. It is rhetorical. So what rhetoric? So we have to go back to the ancient Greeks, as with so many things, to look at the ideas of rhetoric. What is rhetoric? Rhetoric is the technical use of language really to persuade. And Aristotle talks about this, and he identifies 3 key features of rhetorical language. And the first is ethos, the second is logos, and the third is pathos. Okay, so ethos is the credibility or ethical appeal of the speaker. We know, and you know from the advertising industry knows that if you get a review from a well-respected or somebody you respect, so it's your Uncle Tom, and Uncle Tom knows all about motorbikes, so you're going to actually listen to Uncle Tom when he gives you advice about a motorbike, because he knows what he's talking about. So that's the ethos part of it. If we are a very well-respected and if we're a very well-qualified doctor, my views of I'm not, as that person or a lawyer or a philosopher, will be taken, they'll be more credible than Tom down the boozer. Yeah, we don't need experts anymore. Oh, yes, we do. But experts, they are We lend them our belief because of their ethos, because we respect them. So we kind of give them some leeway, we cut them some slack, and we go, if Professor Tom says this, Captain Tom up in space, if he says this, then it must be right, you know? If the newspaper says, if the BBC says it, it's all about ethos, isn't it? That's the first pillar of rhetoric. So you get that first, the person speaking in their authority. So it's Nicky Welt. Oh, yeah, he knows what he's talking about, right? The next one is logos, logical reasoning, and the use of evidence and facts to support an argument. There's some of this due to the rain, but it's not necessarily deductive logic. It doesn't stand or fall. It doesn't turn on things. I forget I just said that. That's what philosophers say. It turns on, not that other sense of turn on, which it didn't. I just don't want to. I wish I hadn't even said that now. So yeah, there's a bit of it. There's a bit of it about, especially in the rain, and yeah, but it's mainly plausible rather than logical. So yeah, especially because it's raining and you're not used to. Well, these are plausible things. They're not logical things. There could be other. You know, it's not an unbroken chain of cause and result. Next one is the power of emotional appeal, and so this, you create an emotional response in your listener. So curiosity, suspense. Writers do this of fiction all the time. Lawyers do this, and I would say that in a law court, so particularly under and I've talked about this before, and people have disagreed with me and agreed with me, but as I understand it, and I'm not a lawyer, although I have, you know, in the past been trained in mental health law. In fact, my master's degree was in that. But I'm not a lawyer. But the English common law system, or the English legal system, which is inherited by those states which have inherited it or taken it up, is about adversarial. It's not inquisitorial in the sense of the main job is not of the court is not to find out the truth. It's to apportion guilt, so it becomes more like a competition. Somebody said it's about, you know, you can have lawyers who are very good who will pervert natural justice, in that they will get criminals, people who are criminals, they will free them, or they will imprison or convict people who are innocent, you know, because it's about winning. So this is where rhetoric comes in. Because if it was just about finding the facts, it would be our scientists, wouldn't it? It'd be our CSI. We'd be looking at the physical evidence and we'd be drawing conclusions using our reasoning, but from the empirical evidence, then we'd draw a conclusion. In some cases, we wouldn't have physical evidence. We would use logic to draw the conclusion. So if it was a purely inquisitorial, we would use both reason and empirical evidence. We'd have philosophers and scientists helping us to get to it, but we don't. We have lawyers who are rhetoricians, if that's a word. They are experts in rhetoric. They are about persuading through their ethos who they are, especially if they're wearing a wig and they're called the King's Counsel and they're Sir somebody. And then we have the logos, which they use fast and loose, I would suggest. And Nicky Welt in this story is fast and loose. It isn't, he claims it's logical, but it's not. It's merely persuasive. And that is the pathos. He persuades and he manipulates the protagonist. But I thought it was a brilliant story. But it just highlights that kind of issue, you know. I've over-egged it a little bit. So, what do I think about in final terms about the story? I think, of course, irony. Let's have irony. The first thing is that he sets out to prove that you can have plausible inferences which are not true. If they were true, that would be logic. It would be if it was logic, they would be true, because that's what reason does, but or seeks to do. But it's merely persuasion. So he persuades of the plausibility, and he says, and his key point is that and fair play to him. Nicky Welt is saying, you know, I can make a whole plausible story which isn't true from this sentence. Yeah. The irony is, it is true. That's one of the great joys of the story. The weak point, I think, this is just my opinion, is that the whole story is carried by the plausibility of the inferences. You're with me? We are going along with the story. We're hearing it as the protagonist, and we are persuaded of the truth, which later turns out to be true, even though he said it wasn't necessarily true. Okay, we've already established that. We are persuaded by the inferences. They have to be plausible to us, and they are plausible. And the one thing that isn't plausible to me in this story is that the initial sentence was overheard and then forgotten by the protagonist. That is not plausible. So, in a sense, that's ironic as well. That the plausibility, the story is about plausibility, but the key fact is not plausible to me. But listen, it took him 14 years. I'm not saying I could have done any better. I thought it was an absolutely fantastic story. It was recommended by one of the listeners. If you know of any fantastic detective stories that are slightly unusual and just brilliant, let me know. Don't let it be a 90,000 word novel, because I can't do that. But short story is fine. So thank you very much for the recommendation. I hope you enjoyed that. It was a great deal of fun, and we managed to talk about Derrida's intertextuality, about the role of rhetoric and logic, and Aristotle. And if you can get all those guys in, you're not doing badly, I think. Hope you enjoyed it. There'll be more to come soon.